David Swanson is author of Daybreak: Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union, and his most recent book, War is a Lie. David holds a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Virginia. He's worked as a newspaper reporter, as a communications director, with jobs including press secretary for Dennis Kucinich's 2004 presidential campaign, and for 3 years as communications coordinator for ACORN, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform. David is now. Let me say that again. The Association of Community Organizations for Reform now. Swanson is co-founder of After Downing Street organization, creator of ProsecutebusCheney.org, and Washington director of Democrats.com. In 2009, David created a website for Code Pink and Global Exchange to market a company investing in wind energy in Iran, and another website for Cindy Sheehan's counter-recruitment efforts. Thank you, David.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and for putting this on. And it's great to speak here with both John and Bruce, both of whom I have learned a lot from. And I, like many of you perhaps, agree with every word that's been said thus far in this room. But that is at least somewhat remarkable in that on most issues that are debated in our public political discourse, Bruce and I couldn't be further from agreement. And of course, most of the issues that we talk about in our communication system, such as it is, tend to be those where the Democrats and the Republicans have some distance between themselves. And they tend to be fairly minor, and they tend to be domestic, and they tend to absolutely ignore the issue of the placement of power within our government. The question of presidents accumulating ever greater powers is just not up for discussion, and the questions of where our money goes, never mind that over half of discretionary spending is going to the military. We have debates about that 40% that isn't, and the people who want to recklessly spend money and the people who want to responsibly not spend money and so forth. Well, you know, those of us, and Bruce and I, and in fact the majority of Americans are in this group, who want to cut the money from the military and put it somewhere useful, whether that be spending it in a useful way or in tax cuts. We're not in that debate at all. So this here today, at least until some of you take the floor, is I think not properly termed a debate. We actually are in agreement on these issues. And when I worked to impeach George W. Bush, as Bruce did as well, it wasn't because of the animosity and the personal cries for vengeance of people who disliked Bush as a human being. It was despite that I wanted to work for Bush's impeachment. It was in order to deny future presidents the powers he was accumulating in the White House. I mean, we all warned that if you allow these powers to be put there, they will be passed along to the next person. And if that person doesn't turn it around, doesn't say this was an aberration and prosecute the crimes and not engage in them, then they will be firmly fixed in place. The Supreme Court has a tendency, when multiple presidents have engaged in a practice without challenge, to treat it now as an established presidential power. And of course, those of us who think it's okay to talk about these issues when the president is a Republican don't want it talked about when the president is a Democrat, and vice versa. But the powers remain the same and continue to build, so that when President McKinley sends troops abroad without congressional authorization and gets away with it, you know, a certain number of people are killed and damage is done, but nothing to compare with what's done by future presidents using the same permissible practice. The horrors and the damage that the CIA has done over the decades around the world, vast majority of it is since Harry Truman left office. Right? And so there's a question, of whether Barack Obama has yet done the level of immediate damage to the world that George W. Bush did in his 8 years, and I don't think so. But Barack Obama is at a worse place than George W. Bush in terms of presidential powers, in that he's kept all of these new powers and fixed them in place. What were secretive abuses when Bush was in town are now formal public policy choices and put down in writing, and in some cases treated as law. And so the damage of having individuals from the two parties and multiple individuals do these things without challenge, and then to make public policy choices out of what used to be crimes, makes whoever the third guy or perhaps woman is to come into that White House in this series pretty powerless to even call things abuses that several years ago were crimes. Bruce talked about a president declaring emergency military rule and throwing out Congress, the sort of thing that some people are up in arms about the governor of Michigan now claiming the powers to throw out town governments and put a corporate friend in charge. Bush claimed these powers openly with an executive decree, part of which was secret. And Congress asked to see the secret parts and was told to go to hell. And now we have a different president, and nobody's asking anymore. They don't care what it is anymore, because it's a different president at the moment. But those powers remain. Today, this morning in Congress, right now they are debating in the House whether to end a war in Afghanistan. That 2/3 of Americans have told a number of pollsters now they want ended. And they put that off in what is perhaps not worth fighting over, but an unconstitutional move. They put first defunding NPR. In fact, they held an emergency meeting to get this going on defunding NPR, and then we'll talk about the war. And Congressman Lundgren stood up and denounced some of his colleagues who were suggesting that perhaps we actually waste more money on the military than on NPR. Well, you can't make that comparison because NPR is not in the Constitution. Unlike the department, and he stumbles and he ums and he stutters and the idea of national defense. Because he knows in the back of his head that the Constitution doesn't establish a military whatsoever. It's written as if we're going to raise a military when we need it for a war, and then not have one anymore. And so then you have Congressman Dreyer stand up and say, taking 77 cents out of the pocket of a good American who may not even listen to NPR, to fund NPR is a threat to our very democracy. We're taking thousands of dollars from the same person to fund the Central Department of Defense, the vast majority of which has nothing to do with defense, is okay. That's acceptable. And it's also unaccountable. It's the department that's not audited, that has secret money, that had new powers established under Bush that allow the secret transfer of money into secret campaigns. We have secret military operations in at least 75 nations now, considerably more than when Bush and Cheney were in town. We have an incredibly expanded war in Afghanistan, and we have this use of drones not just to spy on us and Mexicans, but to kill people in large numbers, including to the extent in Pakistan that it's very hard not to call that a war. And there hasn't been so much as a pretense by anybody of authorizing a war there. We have General Petraeus was testifying yesterday, and a number of Congress members said, we've been doing this year after year. You people come here and you say, we're about to make progress, but it's fragile and reversible and it's just around the corner. And what is to demonstrate to us that 3 or 4 years hence, we won't have some other general telling some other Congress members, we just need a few more years. Progress is right around the corner. And Congress members who said to him, look at all of the corruption and the hopelessness and the lack of progress. And he essentially invited them to what's called a PSYOPs session. This was a psychological operation. That is, if you read Rolling Stone magazine a few weeks back, senators, Congress members, Defense Department officials, think tankers who came to Afghanistan to survey the situation were intentionally misled about so-called progress by a branch of our military that is designed to mislead foreigners, and who then demanded that the Department of Defense investigate itself and assure us that everything's okay. And that's the standard for oversight from Congress, just as President Obama, when asked whether he agreed with the press person from the Department of State that forcing a young man to stand naked and face solitary confinement for months and be otherwise abused without any sort of trial.
Bradley Manning.
A guy named Bradley Manning was, in the words of this former, now, State Department employee, ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. And President Obama's response was, well, the military tells me it's okay, and I leave it up to them. Just as he leaves it publicly up to them whether to escalate a war or continue a war. We have generals who do PR tours to set military policy and publicly instruct the so-called commander-in-chief. This is to do away with civilian rule. When you look at this so-called change, when someone comes in and says, "I'm closing Guantanamo," and you still to this day get, "Oh, but he closed Guantanamo." He never wanted to end the policy of imprisoning people without any process whatsoever. He wanted to move one location where that was occurring from Cuba to Illinois. And the fact that he can't do it, frankly, who cares? Our policy now, and it's not secretive, and it's not considered an abuse, and it's been announced in front of the Constitution in the National Archives and put down in writing and made the law of the land, and a couple of Republican Congress members have objected to that Imperial abuse purely because they want the law to be even worse than Obama's made it. This is to fix in place the elimination of habeas corpus in a way that one president, any president alone, couldn't do. It's the combination. And this is across the board for torture, which this president insists he has the power to do if needed, for warrantless spying, for extraordinary rendition, and the efforts where this White House has put most of its energy on these issues has been in covering up and protecting Obama's predecessor, right? And we have a court case in Washington, D.C. today where they're trying to figure out a creative way to charge a prisoner with a new charge in order to have a conviction, which, as Bruce said and John said, you have to have a conviction now. And to do so, they've gone back to the 1880s and equated the war on Al-Qaeda with the war on Native Americans, which is effectively to reveal that, the good old days were not always so good. We've been an empire from before 1776, and we are stripping people of all rights based on the implicit understanding that they are subhuman and don't deserve them. And then you come back to the so-called homeland and strip everybody of the same rights. And you start with somebody like Bradley Manning. This president campaigned on the need to reward and praise whistleblowers. Now whistleblowers are traitors, and they're subhuman, and they should not have any rights. The people who sat in the Justice Department and legalized aggressive war and torture and lawless imprisonment with secret memos, when things had to be secret in years past, have not been prosecuted. This White House has put extreme pressure on a number of European nations to stop investigations and prosecutions. We have, to the great credit of Italian courts, had 23 CIA agents convicted of kidnapping and sending someone from there to be tortured by the guy who now runs Egypt. We have had extreme efforts by the current Justice Department, which publicly, openly takes all instruction from the President, to block all criminal and civil suits that would expose anything our government's been doing in these matters. And this with claims of secrecy now established in policy that Bush and Cheney never dreamed of attempting. And when Congressman Kucinich asks to go visit Bradley Manning, the Secretary of Defense sends him to the Secretary of the Army, who sends him to the Secretary of the Navy, and they publicly assert that they can't let Congress interfere out of concern for Bradley Manning's privacy. This being the young man who's forced to sleep naked and stand at attention naked in the morning.
In the 6-foot by 12 sail, basically.
Yes, yes. So we have record-setting prosecutions of whistleblowers, not to mention non-prosecuting imprisonments of whistleblowers. We have record-setting denials of Freedom of Information Act requests. Remember all the uproar about Dick Cheney won't show us the visitor logs of the oil barons coming in to meet? Well, Obama still won't show you the visitor logs of the health insurance corporation heads coming in to meet. He'll show you the visitor logs after a certain point in time that he deems worth showing you. And he sends all his staffers just off the White House property to meet with lobbyists so that the names don't end up on the visitor logs. This is the level of reform we have at this point. And when Bush established a new abuse, such as writing a note on the bottom of a law called a signing statement, here are the parts I'll violate. It was secret for a long time. Then it was understood what was happening, and he kept doing it. And it was outrageously unconstitutional and abusive, and people were up in arms. Barack Obama campaigned against this practice, and this is just a typical example, campaigned against the practice, came in and started doing it exactly like Bush and Cheney did it for the first 6 months or so, and then figured out something worse, that he could rely on previous signing statements that already existed, that he could rely on secret memos in the Justice Department. And so he stopped issuing the signing statements. And on Bush's, he said, well, I'll go back and review all of Bush's signing statements, and the ones I don't like, I'll throw out. Right? But how is that any more constitutional than Bush writing them in the first place? You know, there's the third person pick which laws that Bush and Obama wrote at their whim to keep and to throw out. It's not a representative government. So I could go on and on, but I want to get to the discussion, and I want to close with a couple of points on what can be done. And Barack Obama met with big donors yesterday and said, you were excited 2 years ago, you're not excited now, but I need all your money even more. And I would add to that, if you took that money and put it in independent media and put it in independent activism, by which I mean institutions that don't take their direction from either political party, instead of putting it into elections, who's an example of that? Certainly much of the peace movement. Go to my site, warisacrime.org. Certainly a new group called Roots Action. I mean, endless organizations that are free of partisan subservience. Then you will be doing so much more, because you're not going to get a good president out of next year's election, no matter how much money you waste on it, and you're not going to get a republic back from any president. So, you know, empires end. They end horribly or they end gently. And the homeland is usually better off once they've ended. If you want to help, come to the White House at noon tomorrow to end these wars, and come to Quantico, which is even closer, at 2 p.m. on Sunday, to end the open torture of a man who has not been put on trial.